The title of this film, Missing Voices of Disabled Members of the UK Roma Communities. The next slide reads, this study was funded by the National Lottery as part of the Disability Research into Independent Living and Learning drill program for disabled people. The study was carried out in partnership by the University of Worcester and Shaping Our Lives. The opening clip includes Dr. Peter Unwin in front of the University of Worcester banner.
We saw an opportunity with the big lottery and an organisation called DRILL, which is Disabled Research into Independent Living and Learning, to look for any areas in the disabled world where voices were missing. And I spoke to my colleague in Shaping Our Lives, and we identified that voices of disabled people in or across Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities were very much missing. There was nothing written about them, there was no videos about them at all. There seemed to be a completely absent voice.
This slide includes text which says, the project represented the first opportunity to hear the hitherto missing voices of disabled members of Roma communities, and participants in the focus groups were appreciative of the debate having been brought to the open. Peter Unwin will now continue speaking.
So we were successful in bidding for the money, and we engaged with a range of Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities across the UK. We see the Roma issues as rather different to those of travellers and gypsies, so we thought we would do a video specifically about Roma and disability. And I must say that the groups we've met in London, in Belfast, in Liverpool and Sheffield have been very engaging with us and very much wanted to talk about issues of disabled people, how it's seen within their community, and how they might perhaps be able to have a better voice and indeed, on a practical level, get better services for their community members.
The next slide says, many Roma families have come to the UK to find better employment conditions, but housing stock is primarily in the private sector and of poor quality. There were views expressed that landlords would not allow adaptations to accommodate disability. Peter Unwin will now continue speaking.
Our hope is that as this topic has now been broached, we believe this is the first study that's ever looked at issues of disability, particularly within Roma communities. There's been lots done on health and longevity, but in terms of looking at actual disability, the fact that we're now talking about the topic, and as I said, we had no problem really. All the organisations that responded to our offer to get involved have been very positive. And I think that now the subject is in the open, as it were. We very much hope that they will grow as a voice and that they will start to seek out better levels of services. They'll find out where the services are and they'll benefit from them, as well as obviously caring, as they already do, very much in their own communities, as much as they can, for their own disabled members. But there are opportunities out there for disabled people to benefit not only from the love and care of their own families, but also from outside of the family type organisations where there's a fellowship and perhaps an encouragement and hopefully an empowerment that they may be able to speak up and have that voice heard alongside the voices of other disabled people within the communities. The disabled-led organisations that are still thriving all seem to say our doors are open to anybody. Anybody can come to our group. We're not discriminatory. It's not in our nature. But in reality, the message to those disabled-led organisations is that if you genuinely want to include Roma disabled people in your activities and in your lobbying for better services, you need to proactively reach out to them rather than just say everybody's welcome.
The next slide says, there were many comments about a lack of suitable interpreters and the difficulty in understanding concepts and terms relating to disability. We will now meet Becky Meekin, who is seated in a teal chair. Becky is representing Shaping Our Lives organisation.
The research is about two things really. It's about whether disabled people within Roma communities have a voice and are accessing services to help them in their day-to-day lives. And it's also looking at and talking to deaf and disabled people's organisations and asking them, are you working with people from Roma communities? The type of work that we're doing with the University of Worcester is called co-production, where everyone takes part equally and there are no power imbalances between the different types of people.
The next slide says, the roles of community connectors, liaison-type staff employed by charities or government agencies who were sometimes from Roma communities, were seen by community members and the research team as critical links. In the main, however, the knowledge held by the community connectors about disability issues was patchy, and there was no specific guidance on disabled organizations or services available for Roma. We will now meet Teresia Rostas, who is seated in a burgundy chair with books behind her. She is representing the Care for Young People's Future Community Interest Company.
My experience with Disabled Roma so far, because as I said, I have worked for the local authority for nearly 10 years, I have been able to see probably thousands of families with undiagnosed needs or with disabilities or with additional needs that required support. Apart from the education bit, which I used to do, I was able to complete different forms for them and refer them to services such as psychologists, hearing impairment, speech and language, and so on.
The next slide says, we will now present some slides which give conclusions and recommendations from the research project. The next slide says, the project will make recommendations to deaf and disabled people's organizations and community connector organizations about how best to include and advocate for disabled members of their Roma populations, including making information available in accessible formats. The next slide says, there was a low level of interest shown in the Missing Voices project by deaf and disabled people's organizations, many of whom are struggling to survive in times of austerity. The next slide says, there were mixed views across the Roma communities about where they would use mainstream deaf and disabled people's organizations as a way of having their missing voices heard. Two groups said they would, whereas another group said they would only want their own organizations run by and for their own people. Local, customized solutions seem the way forward. The next slide says, deaf and disabled people's organizations do not reach out proactively to disabled Roma people in their communities. None reported actually having Roma members, but most say our doors are open to all, which does not facilitate inclusion. The next slide says, many Roma families in the UK seem to care for their own disabled members, partly through culture, but also because they do not know about local services or organizations, plus a fear of discrimination. The next slide says, cultural legacies of shame and stigma regarding disabled community members remained, with some evidence that such views were changing via exposure to the UK context. The next slide says, music credit, Cousin Kenny Kennard. The next slide. 5 logos on the left include the Community Fund, the Shaping Our Lives, the University of Worcester, and the logos on the right, starting from the top, we see the Centre of Alternative Education and Reintegration for Roma, and the drill logo at the bottom. The final slide says, there are 2 logos, a film by Real Master Production, and another logo by RosaSenCis in the center of the screen.